We'll get started here. Welcome to Argonaut 2024. I hope everyone is having a great Dev Days. So this talks, there's different levels of depths and how deep the Dev Days talks go. And this is going to be, we're going to be pretty high level on the Argonaut initiatives. I'll go deep in a very small number of spots, but my goal is to set folks up to know where to engage the Argonaut Project after. And when you think of the Argonaut Project, well, I guess there's two things. When you walk away from here, I'm hoping you'll know, like, hey, there's a few cool initiatives out there that overlap with stuff I'm interested in, and you join us, okay? And by join us, I mean participate. We are a membership model, but we're not looking for new members. We've already selected our projects. It's open, you're free. We just want your time, which is more valuable than anything else. So, but here we go. I'm Marquard. I'm a consultant with Wave 1. I'm the project manager for Argonaut, but also heavily involved in the development of US Core and other standards. My background is in the EHR implementation space. I grew up doing version 2 and CDA, and then stumbled my way into standards, and I hope some of you also find your way into standards. It's only as good as the feedback we get, and we need real world feedback in those specs. I always, had a few Minnesotan things in the last, and I couldn't help myself, put a few things in, one thing in here. So, all right, so in Georgia they say Coke, in Wisconsin they say soda. What do we say in Minnesota? Pop. I don't know why. It's not that classy. So we're working on soda with our kids. And then another expression. Okay, so pop. You got to be careful with Minnesotans. If you hear the phrase like, that's interesting, you got to watch the voice inflection, okay? Because it can mean like, that was a really great topic and they're actually genuinely interested. It also can mean like, that's kind of weird, or like, you're kind of, that makes no sense. So watch like, oh, that's interesting. So you get, yeah, it's interesting. So just, that's a fair warning. And the other joke from the presentation is like, if you bump into someone, don't say excuse me, just say, ooh, sorry, okay? So if you haven't heard that yet, you can run into me, and if you run into me, I'll say sorry that you ran into me, because that's how I've been taught. All right, so background in Argonaut, prior initiatives, and then we're going to talk about 2024 going forward. What is the Argonaut Project? We're an implementation community of kind of technology vendors, providers looking to advance FHIR and OAuth in healthcare to improve health information exchange. It's that simple. We're private sector funded, initiated, and focus on high priority use cases for our customers, okay? We all have kind of slightly different customers, and so we view that puzzle a little bit differently, but it's something we go through every year to try to set a set of use cases. And we are not a group that, we're happy to look at other projects, so we're not afraid of not invented here, okay? So sometimes we invent things from the beginning, ground up. Other times we look around and say, hey, this CDS hooks thing is pretty cool. We want to test it out and make it production ready, or hard and smart on FHIR, or other projects such as IPA. We are not a standards development organization, a separate legal entity, or proprietary. So HL7 is the standards body. Argonaut has become what we call an accelerator trying to advance HL7 standards, or even beyond. But in terms of our membership mix, you can see we have some of the leading EHR vendors, technology vendors, a few cloud vendors, a few payers have snuck in there over time, and then of course clinical organizations to keep us honest on our specs. So here's one slide of most of our initiatives that we've covered over the years, but I put them on a timeline. I'll talk kind of briefly through that timeline to help folks, because I know there are folks in the room who've been and know Argonaut from the beginning, and others are in the room who maybe have just heard Argonaut for the first time. So we grew, it's really hard to get my head around. Someone emailed me and said, hey, did you know that Argonaut's going to turn 10 this year? And I was like, oh man, I think of Argonaut with when my first kids was 1 year old, and I think, man, he's he's getting older. Argonaut's growing up. But it started out of this JSON task force report. So in the US, there was a group of really smart scientists who wrote this JSON report, and they had some big, bold recommendations in there that we should have a unified healthcare architecture. Okay, everyone should migrate from these legacy platforms, and it was really bold. One piece of it is they talked about API access, and so this big report came out. There was a task force looking at the report, and they made some set of recommendations. Say, hey, and there was a call to action to say it's time for open APIs, and let's look to FHIR. And shortly after that, the Argonaut project was formed with a core set of EHR vendors and launched. And the first set of projects out of that, the FHIR spec, it's so funny now to look back and say like, hey, of course it's FHIR. That wasn't an obvious choice in 2014. And so one of the first projects actually was to look at CCDA. So how many folks know the clinical document architecture? How many folks had to parse that? Yeah, fun, yeah, okay. So one of the projects was like looking at that clinical data model and say like, hey, that's been around for, gosh, in 2014 had been around over 15 years. You know, that model, folks have experience with it, is all those data elements, is there coverage in the FHIR model, all the resources. And there was some pretty, and remember Rick helped with this, others helped, like doing this mapping, and we didn't do a detailed full mapping because a full mapping between these standards is incredibly complex, but it was like, all right, we can do meds, allergies, kind of core sets of things, and we gave the kind of green light in early January, February 2015 that FHIR looks pretty good. And as that year progressed, we did some actually testing of Smart on FHIR that year also. A full security review to give it the nod that, yeah, this is also a good way to do authentication and access. And ONC did something very smart. I always pat them on the back for 2000, not that they care if I pat them on the back, but in 2015, they did something really smart in the regulatory framework, is they said, hey, you have to certify your EHR and provide open APIs and documentation. They didn't actually name FHIR. And so this is the first, I shouldn't say the first, an example for me where the regulators are saying, hey, we want to go this direction, but we're going to let the market sort some of this out instead of naming a standard up front. And I would say that's an incredibly powerful thing because it allowed the industry to say, hey, some people didn't go to FHIR. Like there's a few major EHR vendors who published their own kind of internal APIs with documentation because they had people connecting, and that was okay. But the majority said, hey, FHIR looks good. The community of Argonaut, you know, worked very hard and produced the data query implementation guide in 2016, which became kind of a de facto standard for FHIR DSQ2. We didn't stop there. We thought, man, this consortium, or I don't know what we call accelerator, accelerator is becoming a name, is working pretty well. What are things we'd like to tackle? So we did a project on provider directory. Funny, I see Cooper over there, you know, did a lot of work on trying to make that happen. Started doing some testing on CDS hooks. And around CDS hooks, we developed a quick start guide, provided some input to a reference implementation, and even maybe call it a sandbox because it's easy to plug in and play with it very quickly. But then 2018, I think, is where we got, you know, additional kudos in the industry as Apple joined Argonaut and actually implemented the Argonaut DSQ2 APIs to download and enable patients to have their patient record directly on their phone. CDS hooks, so there's kind of this interesting, I'll show a picture later in the slide about kind of HL7 is good at producing standards. There's a lot of work to go through the standards balloting process. And so sometimes we choose not to do that early on. And so CDS hooks is one of those products we let kind of test in industry and support. But eventually in 2018, we said, hey, let's take it to ballot. And one of the benefits of ballot is you get broader feedback. It's very structured. And it does kind of, in terms of regulatory view, it's seen as being more stable and you know, sometimes gets the nod that it's maybe more implemented. That may not always be true, but it definitely is a place for stronger feedback. Carrier Quality did implement parts of our provider directory guide, and you know, the work kept coming. The clinical notes design, so if you want to understand how to exchange clinical notes, that was an Argonaut project that folded into US Core. If you understand how we view provenance, and provenance is a huge topic, folks. Even saying the word makes me sweat. Is that, you know, it's cool in here. You know, provenance is how you move information between different systems and keep track of who edited and what they did with it. We defined something called basic provenance and tried to keep it very careful and kind of came up with this term like last hop. Like, you know, you can't, some people are going to say, Brett, you need to pass the full chain of everything and you need to know everything along the way. And we created some very simple scenarios to say, like, if I pass it to you and you edit it, you know, and you pass it to the next person, you need to better make sure you note that you edited it as you pass it along. But at some point, passing the entire chain gets really quite complex. So anyway, there's a section in the spec about quite basic provenance, but I expect at some point we're going to be nudged to expand that, and we'll need your input to do it in a smart way. Subscriptions, it's funny to see this here. This is the first kind of starting of subscriptions. You know, Gino Canessa has a great talk this afternoon on that, but it's the first kind of inkling of it, but it continues to grow, and you'll see that mentioned. Smart web messaging. 2020 was kind of the big significant event in that regulation actually named FHIR, and named FHIR R4, and named US Core 311 as something that the broad industry would kind of stabilize on. We did a little bit of work on kind of bulk data group level export, granular controls, and so granular controls, I think Josh, if you saw Josh's talk, instead of giving access, say I'm gonna give you access to all observations, the ability to say, I'm gonna give you access to vital signs, or a specific type of observation. That's something that we started to develop guidance on. Did a little work on patient lists, and I mentioned some of these were like, we did a lot of work, there's kind of a published kind of approach to it, but we didn't necessarily take it to the final standards home, and so I never know when I look at these lists again and think, I wonder if we'll pick patient lists back up. So we'll see. In 2021, we did an updated of Smart on FHIR, and then subscription design really got moving. We did our first round of FHIR Right. I'll talk a lot about FHIR Right later. Smart health links. So the idea that you can provide a barcode. For the example, anyone seen the International Patient Summary kind of demo with the barcode? Okay, a few folks. So the idea that you can actually present, there's the Commons Project app, which is an app to download information on the Android platform. You actually have the ability to generate a QR code, which you could show to a provider, really any third-party person, that then they can access and download your IPS summary. We did a little work on this thing called the electronic health information. Sorry, there's a requirement to export everything in the US market, okay? It's called the EHI export, electronic health information export. And this is another one where we did a bunch of work, and we'll see where it lands, but the idea is there's different ways to kick off this process. So some people have the ability to kick it off through your portal, and it's just, there's not like a kind of single kind of unified way to do this across the vendor community, and so we defined an API, a way to actually kick that off. It hasn't been adopted broadly, but we'll see if more work and testing is done on that. Subscriptions add R4B and R5, another round of FHIR Right. You'll hear about packages acting as brands later. And then last year we did a big push on imaging access. Has anyone been successful with imaging access in FHIR? Okay, I see a few hands. It's a really interesting thing. There's this great resource, the imaging study resource, to kind of index, and you can pull the DICOM image along. We focused a lot on how to enable patient access to that, and one of the things we learned is, and some of you may know this very well, is you kind of have your core EHR, you have your ancillary systems around there, which the EHR can connect over to, but kind of the authentication and authorization, how you get into that risk pack system to pull back the image, isn't super straightforward for an outside party. Like within a health system, they have it really nicely defined. You can click that link. There's kind of a tight authentication mechanism. But opening that up has been a challenge. So I'm optimistic that will be reinvigorated in the future. And then we did FHIR Right again, because we like to keep doing FHIR Right. Okay. Oh, the frogs. If you've seen the frogs, we support the US CDI cycle. And I say support in that we take a strong design stance early on to try to drive what the future ballot is going to be. So the Argonauts actually hosted designs. Gosh, we might have even done some in April and May of this year. ONC hasn't even finalized it, but we're already starting to do design work for the new US CDI version 5, which will be published hopefully in July. All right, I always have Eddie Murphy in the back of my head, my mind. I can't recommend he's a crazy comedian, but the sketch is pretty vulgar, but it's always in my mind, like, what have you done for me lately? And that's something every year we think about here. And so here is the plan we're a part of this year. So the first thing, and I know I'm flying through it, but I want to at least kind of make sure, because I know there's different interests in different areas here. These are the rough timelines, maybe not the prettiest timeline graphic, but we did a granular scopes mini. So for folks who do standards development, sometimes you propose a standard and you put a bunch of stuff in there with the hope people give you feedback on it because you're not quite sure. Like the ideal case is everybody's agreed on it, there's been strong testing, and then you go to ballot and there's kind of refining, just like you're sanding it down. Sometimes you're not totally sure what the right thing to do, and maybe you're going to ballot a little early. And so I think with granular scopes, we threw a few things in there that maybe shouldn't have been in there. And so the Argonaut said, maybe we should test this out some more before we finalize a standard that we may be regulated to, which is a reasonable request. And so early of this year, we did 3 kind of quick calls to look through like, what's the appropriate level of expectation or requirement on the EHR servers for granular scopes. In the rule, so HCI1 rule, ONC regulation affects everyone who's certified health IT. They talked about condition and observation. And we as a kind of group said, all right, that's a pretty good spot to start. We added a whole new page in the spec to describe Smart on FHIR obligation, or sorry, we proved the granular scopes and added a page on Smart on FHIR obligations. And so for where we landed, you'll see like, these are the set of scopes that, every system, this is in US Core 7.0, so this is probably shouldn't say probably, it's a few years out, but you see EHR developers starting to think about it. These are the initial set of scopes that we expect everyone to support to conform to US Core. And we did put, if you look at that page at the bottom for granular level scopes, we do have a few additional kind of mays and shoulds up there, which are kind of pointing in the direction of what we expect to fold into in the future release. So that's granular scopes. And I'm going to bounce back and forth. So Argonaut projects are kind of funny in that we try to keep them to a year. Okay? Sometimes standards projects can roll over and go and go and go. And we kind of say, we're going to do the best we can in about a year, publish something and test it. And so some folks in the Argonaut community said, hey, a year is too big for some of these projects, and like we don't need granular scopes for years, so can we do these mini projects? So when we used to do like 2 or 3 projects, now we do like, I think this is 7 projects, but anyway. So I'm gonna go short, long, okay? So for long, I'm gonna go with bulk, okay? Dan gave a great talk, actually 2 talks this week on bulk. I really recommend going back and looking at those. But bulk data is an API to enable kind of population level access to data. One of my favorite use cases is when we talk about attribution or value-based care, trying to manage patient lists. How do you exchange the roster of patients that a particular health plan would like you to be responsible for, and you communicating back that you are in fact taking care of those. We've hosted, kind of in partnership with Smart, 8+ connectathons, help kind of continue to refine this guide. But it is a foundational guide that's not scoped to a specific use case. So while I talk about that payer use case, there are folks who are trying to use it for immunizations, like how to, if a school wants a whole set of patients' immunization records, or other places you want to, or populate a clinical data warehouse. There's a whole variety of use cases that the kind of foundational bulk spec is meant to support. And that's where Argonaut really does their work, is trying to do foundational specs. So this year, there are several, I think there were like 6 projects that folks wanted to add to bulk, and we said, we can't tackle 6, what are a few appropriate ones to consider? And so we went with 3 this year. So the first one is on kind of trying to optimize the export by testing out type filter. Another one is generating data instead of by resource type, but by patient or encounter. And then we're going to wade into group definitions. So how do you define the group that you're going to export? There's a kind of a variety of ways which folks support that today. And I don't even want to forecast exactly how we're going to solve this. But it's going to kick off probably July of this year. So if you're interested in bulk and you're thinking about, we're having a hard time defining groups, this is something that fearless Dan Gottlieb is going to dive into, and we'll see if we can come up with something that fits for the broader industry. I did just pull a thing so for type filter, the ability to say, I want active prescriptions or laboratory, or you're trying to basically filter down the overall search to say, hey, I want laboratory observations instead of all observations. And so this is something that was experimental in the spec. We did a round of feedback, and here's a set of guidance that is in a quote. It's in a pull request that we plan to add to the spec the next time bulk goes out to ballot. And I don't know. Yeah, there's even a little diagram to talk through how this actually works. I'm not going to walk through this, but I just want you to know it's there. Bulk optimized by patient, it kind of cracks me up. I thought this was going to be like a 2-week call. Instead of joining files by resource type, all the observations, all the conditions, all the whatever, which you resort when you import somewhere else, we just organize it by patient, Brett, record, export, done. But the debate went is that one file? Do we export every patient in a single file, all their information? And folks, I got 1 million patients. Who's going to want to manage 1 million files? So okay, all right. Well, maybe we should like stick a little, like, you get to the end of a patient record, there's just a carriage return, it ends. Or let's add a parameter resource, and then we're like call 4. Maybe we should use the composition resource, call 5. So some of these things are harder than you think of, like, how do you reorganize information? So instead of, anyway, this is not done. So if you're interested in, like, how do I improve bulk export, and you're interested in doing it by patient, someone's like, let's just do the bundles. And folks are like, I don't have to rewrap the bundles for about 1 million patients. You can, welcome to standards, guys. But we're going to solve this in 2 weeks, okay? So 2 weeks from today, June 26th, okay, June 26th. We're going to move on. We're going to get an answer, and we're going to test it. Because when I say we get an answer, yeah, we just have to pick at some point, right? Like, this is one of the cases where, like, there's pros and cons to all these choices, and it's not entirely clear to me what the best answer. I don't think it's clear to me within, I don't know. You're in these group dynamics, right? And there's always someone who has a very strong opinion about the way they want to do it. And then there's like this kind of, and hopefully there's a lot of people with that strong opinion, so you can just like, that's the answer. And this is the case where there's one person who has a very strong opinion, and then there's like a whole bunch of people with like kind of medium opinions across the board. And so it's very hard in that situation to decide what to do. So we're going to test this out. We'll figure it out. I mean, another part of that is like, you talk about all the resources about a patient, like what do you do about like locations or practitioners or things that are common across, like, you don't need to have okay, so you export all the information about a patient, you have their encounter information. Do you include that location resource in every single patient file, or do you reference out somewhere else? Anyway, these are some complexities that came up, and I joke also that came up, like, I've coined this Cooper's Law, like, okay? If you have a population of more than 1 million patients, million records, one of those patients' records will be too big to fit into a single file. Okay, we don't know where that limit is, but sometimes, unfortunately, patients are admitted for 5, 6, 7 years. And so you have to have a plan of like, we can't just break in that case. And so we had a long conversation about file continuation. And anyway, if you're interested in bulk, we have a full year project, 2 weeks, we're gonna solve the by patient this problem, and then we're going to move on to group definition, because I think group definition is going to take a long time. Okay, patient access brands mini. So when you have your iPhone or Android, Apple has a native in it, but if you have the Android Commons app, how do you figure out which health system to connect to? EHRs. It's been an interesting evolution of like, there are now requirements for EHRs to publish the endpoint resource. And the HHI-1 rule did kind of an interesting thing to say, like, oh, you need to use these resources as endpoint organization, but they didn't have a standard way, this didn't exist, okay? There wasn't a standard that said, here's the format in which you publish your kind of branded FHIR endpoint. And so as a patient, you want to enable that patient to be able to kind of open up and pick their health system, and then connect the app to that health system and log in and download that information. And in the US market, we sometimes have many St. Mary's or in an area. And so that kind of connecting that branding information with that endpoint is something that the feedback is pretty important. So we did a little testing on it, and through the HL7 process, we got some feedback that like this isn't just about patients, but providers also want to connect to multiple different health systems. And so the project got renamed User Access Brand. And this was a commenter from the international community. And so I think we sometimes think like, hey, US, US, US. But when we publish our specs for ballot, anybody can comment. And we get different perspectives, and it was a very valuable thing. Josh did, in his SMART overview talk, went a little bit deeper into user access brands. So I'll just say, if you're really curious about, if you're having to publish endpoint information for your FHIR server, that's a good place to check out. I couldn't help but show the frogs again. For folks who came to the US CDI talk yesterday, we're like chilling on a log right now, okay? Like US Core is published a few weeks ago. ONC has yet to publish the new US CDI. So we get to relax a little bit. And I say relax, like we swam around a little bit, but we're hanging out on the logs right now because once ONC publishes, they're starting the leapfrog again, where we have to start our work. And so what this is ONC has their US, I'll go through this very quickly because there's a whole talk on this, but ONC has their US core data for interoperability, which is a standard set of data classes and elements. Every year, ONC is raising the bar and adding new data elements. It's never clear to me how many elements they're going to add or exactly the level of complexity. One of the jokes I have with one of my colleagues over there is like we're okay with a little bit of pain, but we want the right amount of pain. Don't make it too painful, because it's hard to kind of keep up with the good design in the spec and actual EHRs and the community following along. And also, the further ONC leaps ahead, that little frog can't keep up. You gotta make sure we can keep together. Okay, so our view on US CDI, and this is, I say R is not Argonaut. R is the kind of core editing team. It's standards agnostic. It's not really US CDI. They call it a standard, but it really is like a policy guidance document that becomes real in the US core standard and also becomes real in consolidated CDA. So we don't just do it in US core today. We do it in both standards, but. It's important to note this sets the floor. You can reasonably expect every EHR, well, EHRs have to certify to US core. So the good news is they should have consistent implementation within those set of elements. Here's a screenshot of it. And then for folks who, I always like to show this mapping because I think sometimes people get lost. We did 2 releases of V1. For folks who have heard the lovely 2 innocent words, must support, or have ever had to write a guide called include must support, I think we've refined that definition probably up through version 5. And remember, there were 3 versions before this. So every time we rewrote must support and made it better. And if you're looking, I know the regulation names 311. I really believe, I believe 4.0 is the spot that actually has better guidance on must support, because we did these things like must support was on multiple choice elements. So the value data type has value string, value code, sample data quantity. And so it's which one am I required to support? And we only learned this, I shouldn't say we only learned this, we just said pick one, it's fine. But the certifiers, the testing tools said, we can't just pick one, we have to pick them all. And so then we said, all right, we got to agree. And so 4.0 has very clear, nice, the tag has now moved underneath. And part of that was a publication function. We didn't have that feature, we now have it. So future US core, here's where to check it out. Okay, subscriptions, I had to stick it in here. Gino, I had to. Tell me when the data changed. And Gino's going to have a full talk on this, and did some fabulous work defining some new resources, subscription topic and status. And if you think about FHIR release 4, release 5, release 6, we thought the momentum for release 5 could come from subscriptions. And among other things, there are other good things in R5. And folks said, I really want to use subscriptions in R4. How do I do this? And so Gino and the community was kind enough to do a backport release. And so if you want to understand how to do subscriptions in release 4, you'll see in the UV subscriptions backport guidance on how to implement it on an R4 server. But I'm not mentioning subscriptions just because I love it, but I'm mentioning it because we had to do a project on what we call detecting and reporting changes. And this is an example, I think, where folks read the FHIR spec and think, sweet, there's this last updated thing. I just call it, and I get the most up-to-date data. And one of our client apps came to us and said, I keep calling last updated. Some vendor gives me nothing. Some vendor gives me everything all the time. And we're like, well, tell us more. What do you think is actually going on underneath there? And so the last update is kind of a way to say, hey, I want the most recent update if there's been changes to the resource. It's a reasonable request. The vendor implementation of it varies quite a bit. Okay? And part of it is if you were to look at the immunization profile in US core, it's got 5 elements. Okay, so an immunization, I don't think lot number is even required in there. There's additional things in there. And some systems, because they're not all FHIR data stores, and most of them are not FHIR data stores, they may add a new mapping, a new term to that problem. They may change the provider's address. Should that trigger an update? And some folks had interpreted that in their database of anytime the record I store, which is way bigger than the FHIR record changes, I consider it's updated. And so it's updated. But to the client app that's accessing it, that only sees those 5 elements, they don't see a change. Okay? And so we had this kind of gnashing of teeth, and like, oh, what do we, the FHIR purists would say, you got to constrain to those 5. You can't possibly like allow that type of update. And in US Core, we try to be very pragmatic. And this is a new thing for us. This just came up in a few months back. We said, all right, let's try to give the best guidance we can. And so part of guidance sometimes starts from like good documentation. So first off, we'd like everybody to support the last updated parameter. That's what the should is about. But the key part is that shall, to say, you got to document how you do it. And every FHIR server has a capability statement, and here's where you document how you're approaching the last updated thing. And additionally, to client apps who read our spec, here's this giant STU note about like what behavior you may experience with servers. And we know this is not perfect, but this is like in ballot. Someone came up with this problem to us, and we thought, let's at least expose the problem so everybody knows to not rely on last updated, or you're going to get more information on last updated than you expect. OK, I know I'm flying through here. All right, FHIR right. 2021, we were big and bold. We said, we're going to define FHIR right. We'll apply it to all US Core resources. We'll set some guidelines. It'll be very straightforward. And we kind of got into it. We had a few principles. We talked about this thing called like little p provenance. Like within a resource, you have like author. There's a fair bit of like information within a resource without using the provenance resource. And we wrote some guidelines. We got, as the year ground on in 2021, we're like, man, we're not going to get there. And so the year ended, and I have to say, we learned a lot, but it was definitely, we realized we took too big a bite of a project. FHIR right is too big to say you're going to solve FHIR right in one go. So in 2022, we stepped back, and we almost didn't do this kind of persisting app state in 2022, but a few vendors had partnered with Apple to kind of come up with a, I'll say custom way, because it was only a set of vendors. It wasn't a community process. But the good news, it was more than one, and so they had defined a way that with your phone and your provider, you could write a kind of piece of app state to the provider's EHR, which is like a decryption key, which then the provider could use that decryption key to download your encoded medical record and decrypt it, and the provider could see what was on your phone within their EHR. And there's about 5 of our member, I don't know, 3 or 4, I don't know the exact number, remember, kind of developed and supports this process with their customer, which is great. But it wasn't through the standards process, and it made some choices that maybe didn't perfectly fit with the spec. And so in 2022, we actually standardized that and put it into Smart App Launch as kind of an experimental state to see if others pick up on this approach, and then eventually may become a kind of formal standard. Anyway, so we made progress writing this like little piece of the code. OK, that's progress. We're like, we got to try again, guys. So 2023, we scoped to vital signs. OK. And so the idea of like home monitoring is becoming more of an important way for providers to interact with patients. And so we had a kind of year effort, and there's new informative guidance. So if you're going to do FHIR right, there's new informative guidance in US Core for vital signs. And in 2024, we're doing blood glucose. It's pretty common for diabetics now to wear continuous glucose monitors. And the current workflow of that is it syncs to an app or syncs to a third party. And how that exactly gets to the provider, there's kind of there's some kind of cool, like the different device vendors have invented some kind of cool ways within their apps of how they could share it. But in terms of directly integrate in the patient's record, where we know providers want things in their workflow, fit in with other pieces, haven't quite fully cracked that kind of in a broad standards way. And there was a group out there, the Argonaut Project, that they're still in existence. This is a diagram directly from their 2022 report. You can kind of see, patients have this kind of sender to their CGM system, and then they can view it within the portal, or maybe it goes directly to the cloud, and there's kind of a pathway where it gets shared to the EHR. But when this was done in 2022, even simple things, I won't say simple, but like LOINC codes weren't available for all the things that they wanted to exchange. Those are now, as of like 2 weeks ago, now available. And so we have an initiative. We're actually going to do lunch tomorrow. For anyone who wants to talk CGM right, here's a quick plug, to just kind of bring the folks who are working on this project together to talk about where we're heading. We've only had about 3 or 4 calls, but we have very strong participation across the devices, the EHRs, the client apps, to try to make this happen. And as we talk about rights, one of my friends in the audience shared, like, hey, rights are actually happening. We have 190 apps out there doing rights. We have 280,000 crate update calls in the last year. A lot of them are around this one Marquard project, but it's happening, and this is going to, I think, grow over time. And I do, I think Virginia at the beginning talked about, like, you have to integrate things in the in the provider's workflow, and like how do there's still some of this tension of like, can you just directly write to the record? And so this is why I think it makes it hard, is you're potentially changing information. We view it as improving information. They may not necessarily see it that way. So, okay, so what does success look like? We're hoping to either a new international guide, because this isn't US specific, or maybe a US Core Futures page. And so the way I think about this is like, oh man, the one didn't work here. Oh. Well, I guess we get the horses breaking out of the merry-go-round, all right? Like, we went round and round in FHIR right. I feel like this is the year we're going to, the horses are going to break free, and we'll have really strong guidance. So, Argonaut. So here's the projects we completed this year. Projects in flight. So the 2 big ones right now to plug into are bulk optimize and continuous glucose monitoring right back, and US Core will kick off this summer. My friends, I saw Dan Vreeman and Diego use this slide about standards development. I couldn't help but be like, oh, we got to keep, I'll show this slide to folks to know the full process, but really to show where I see Argonaut fitting into this process. We're pretty good about building communities, doing a little bit of planning, and doing testing and feedback. The balloting piece we only do if we have very strong support within that first phase. We do not ballot everything unless there's clear implementer support. I know I only have 5 minutes left. I can't help but talk about project selection in Argonaut, because I know folks are probably like, how do you pick these projects, and how do I get my project in this list? So here's how we do project selection. Give us your ideas. We collect any ideas from any members. We even collect ideas from non-members, okay? Give us 2, 3, 4 sentences, that's great. The way we parse down that list is we make you create 2 slides, and the members create those slides, or they partner with someone to create them. So we start last year, I think we had about 20. After you were forced to create 2 slides, that list went down to 10. So 2 slides is a good way to get people to cut down, if they want to do something. Then we do these pitch sessions, voting, and the pitch sessions we joked about being Shark Tank. It's a friendly Shark Tank. There's not, we're all very kind. But the end day is, it's voting, you can vote for something, but if you don't vote for it and say you're going to develop to it, we don't want to do that project. You have to commit to doing it. And so we kind of weight people's ranking to how committed they are to writing software with it, and that's how we select. So here's the 10-ish projects that were run were pitched. So this is in the deck. You can see exactly what was shared with the steering committee. Each of these links has a 2-slide pitch that goes with it of why we should do this project. There's a lot on this list that got selected this year. And so anyway, getting projects selected, I kind of always churn, does it drive sales? Do standards drive sales? I don't know. I don't think so. People just assume it's going to, well, maybe more now today than in the past. In the past, people just assumed things would work. But there's always this thing of how does everybody rank it? And I think some people rank does it serve an existing customer? Does it meet a policy need? Every member kind of ranks within their own rubric. I do think policy requirements have driven us more in the recent years than we did in the beginning. Which is okay, but I always like the projects that serve an existing customer or actually have a burning problem, which goes with Virginia's #1 rule of find the burning need. If you're trying to solve a problem, if it's a burning need across the EHR community, it's a great project. And I also, for me, I think about clear problem statement, building a community, and then invest in testing. And it's funny, this is a currency of time. We talk about I say about joining Argonaut, participating in Argonaut, money is not the problem, actually. It's people's time and input and knowledge. That's the bigger problem for us, and I think for all accelerators, is people actually testing the products. And then I got to the end, of course, I added one more slide last night. We love international patient access, guys. Like we don't want just US access, we want international access. And so there is a product, you're going to hear about it, I think it's either later today or tomorrow, International Patient Summary, kind of a document exchange. Peanut butter and jelly is one of the folks I've been given out there, like an IPA as the IPA layer. And then since we're a bunch of nerds, we like kicked around all these different logos to go with it. I don't know if there's on the show, like which logo do we want to use? Someone told me, one organization said never put letters on a logo. And I was like, what do you mean? Like this would look great. But they said no. So anyway, we're working on a logo for IPA, but that's a project that later this fall, it's been an ongoing HL7 project. This is one where it's, we didn't invent it, but we're happy to support it. And so we're probably going to, the plan is to do a little bit of marketing and communication about how our membership supports IPA. So the end message, we want you, we want your time. We want you to participate. Things are only as good, and I say we. The we is not Argonaut. The we is the collective HL7 community, because there are more projects than these are the Argonaut projects, right? There are other accelerators. So if you're a payer, if you're in public health, if you are in research, there are spots in HL7 for you, and we absolutely need your input to make the specs as good as they can be. Here's how to participate in the Argonaut projects. We have a Confluence page, and that's Zulip chat. There's 4 of us here you can talk to. We all wear different hats, but we're all passionate about the Argonaut project. We sometimes joke, we don't make the FHIR APIs you deploy, we make them better. That's it. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great DevDays. Are you okay? You do all right? I got 4 minutes. Oh, all right. Do you have any questions? Oh.
Thanks. So you mentioned having implementer support for the initiatives here. Is there coordination across implementers to understand when they may actually get around to implementing the initiatives decided by the Argonaut group?
Like so I think the question is
timelines.
Timelines of when someone's actually going to implement one of the projects. Yeah, that's really tricky. We don't do kind of a publication of like when each vendor is going to publish something. We've had a few initiatives in the past where we did a scheduling IG, and we've done kind of like inventory of capabilities where we've said, all right, how far did everybody implement the spec? And so we published, say, and this would land on our Confluence page. We said, all right, here's how far each vendor took the spec, because in some cases, remember, each vendor has their own set of customers, like their own client apps, and they don't need to do the whole thing. And so a few cases, we've done that for assessments, we've done that for scheduling, where we've inventoried what people have actually implemented in the end, but we don't actually keep track of their timelines. And that would be a really interesting thing to do. I suspect they're always shifting, but yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
So you mentioned the original Argo, right, was too broad and kind of impossible to build and implement. So like looking at CGM now, focusing on one set of devices, is there a risk that it's too narrow? So like a lot of people implement diabetes devices because there's a lot of patients, but if you're a patient with a more rare condition, rare device, there's not going to be a community to build a standard for you to implement.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andy. And I think so the question is about, if we do CGM, we're doing CGM. But by selecting CGM this year, like, is that too narrow of a use case? It's a good question and something for us to be thinking about as we develop guidelines for CGM, like how applicable is it to other devices and other use cases? Because ultimately, we would like to have generic guidelines for, we probably can't do it for every single device out there. And so I'm hoping, from my perspective, I'm hoping what we learn from CGM is a set of guidelines that then can grow to other things. So it's like, we went too broad, we kind of shook down, and now we're going like super specific. And there are parts even within this, I'm like, Josh and I have gone back, and Josh Mandel is kind of our leader of this project. I'm still struggling with like the patient link. Like, you talk about like how do you link the device to the patient is like a common problem across like every device. And we talk to like, I think we talked to 6 or 7 either device vendors, aggregators, folks before we even kicked off the project, and it came up over and over again of like, how do I link the patient device? Here's the workflows we use. Here's how it kind of works. And so that's going to be consistent across the devices, across the use cases. And we're not going to solve it, but I think where the argument I was going to say Josh and I have is I want to inventory the approaches people are taking to that. There's a little bit of like, can we even inventory, because there's so many different ways that folks have tackled it. But no, it's a good question. I'm hoping it's not too narrow. I'm hoping what we learn we can like spread out and apply to a variety of use cases. Thanks, Andy. We're good? All right. Awesome. Thank you.